Good evening, and welcome to the third and final program in our three-part series, Understanding Islam. I am County Supervisor Joe Simidian. Once again, my office is very pleased to be able to co-host this program with the Mountain View Human Relations Commission. We appreciate their participation in this joint effort. And by the way, as I have asked at each of our three sessions now, could we please give a special thanks to the City of Mountain View and the staff for hosting us here in their Center for Performing Arts. We are delighted for the third time in a row now to have such a wonderful crowd. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are here for the third in this three-part series after having gone to the first two? Okay. I told our speakers that you were a committed lot, and you have proven me right, so thank you for that. As I have at each of the previous sessions, I want to hold up one of the question cards. You should all have them handed to you when you walked in the room. During our program this evening, there will, of course, be time for your questions. We have struggled, frankly, to fit in the questions because we've had so many good questions, but that's a nice problem to have. And if you'll just fill them out, and when you hold up your card, someone from my office or from the Human Relations Commission will come by and pick up your card, and we'll get them organized and bring them up. And sometimes I'll bundle together 3 or 4 questions that are a little bit similar, and that'll help us make as much progress as we possibly can. Now, let me also ask that your questions this evening focus on tonight's topic. And the topic, of course, has been Understanding Islam at all 3 of our sessions. But tonight's specific and particular topic is fear of the faith, Sharia, surveillance, terrorism, the Muslim ban, what's real and what's not. Our conversation this evening is once again being taped by KMVT. That's for broadcast at a later date, so we're going to ask that all cell phones please be turned on silent at this time, or simply off. And also, I know we've had some issues with sound at the last couple of programs. We think we've got most of that worked out, but again, if you would like an assisted listening device, they are available in the lobby should you need one. And finally, one last bit of housekeeping. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please take a moment to look for your closest exit. Yes, it's the door you came in or the door to the side. And now, on to the program for this evening. As I have said before, I think we are lucky to live in one of the most diverse places on the planet, certainly one of the most diverse places here in our country. But without understanding the diverse cultures amongst us, misconceptions will abound. So our goal here tonight, as it has been at each of our sessions, is really very simple: to create a better understanding of Islam among the general public. And I want to begin by introducing tonight's panelists. With us tonight is Amina Jandali. Amina Jandali is a founding member of the Islamic Network Group. She also teaches at San Francisco City College. Amina received her bachelor's degree in history from the University of Illinois and her master's degree in Near East Studies from UC Berkeley. Amina frequently delivers presentations on Islam and has appeared on many news outlets speaking on issues of importance or relating to American Muslims. Jihad Turk, who was with us 2 weeks ago, is the president of the Bayan Claremont Islamic Graduate School. He received his undergraduate degree in history and Arabic from UC Berkeley and his master's degree in Arabic and Islamic law from the University of Texas. He also co-founded the Muslim Christian Consultative Group and the Greater Los Angeles Muslim Jewish Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Amina Jandali and Jihad Turk to the program tonight. Thank you. I'm going to do something a little bit different tonight. And before I begin with a question, I want to preface the question with a few quotes. And I think you'll know who these folks are. From President Trump's inaugural address, the quote is, "We will unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the earth." President Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, said, and again I'm quoting, "We are facing another ism, just like we faced Nazism and fascism and imperialism and communism. This is Islamism, It is a vicious cancer inside the body of 1.7 billion people on this planet, and it has to be excised. The president's next national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, had a different take and a different tone. He said, the term radical Islamic terrorism is not helpful because, quote, terrorists are un-Islamic, end quote. Muslims who commit terrorist acts are perverting their religion. Very different takes. What do you make of these comments? Who'd like to begin?
So I'll go ahead and start. I was actually invited to the White House under the previous president. That seemed like so long ago. And there was a summit on countering violent extremism. And here I was, an imam, a religious leader in the Muslim community in Southern California with a very large congregation. The mosque there that I was heading up was founded in 1952, which isn't old for churches and synagogues here in the United States, but for Muslims, that's a pretty well-established community. And so in the run-up to our visit to the White House and our participation in looking at best practices to help build resilient communities, to inoculate the communities from the recruitment efforts that ISIS was making online. If you remember, there was this group called ISIS back in the day, and they were trying to recruit young people from around the world, including here in the United States. And so there was a lot of concern around that. And so the White House asked, well, where's the Muslim community doing well, and what can we learn from them? And so I participated in a number of activities where, gatherings where organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations attended, and other national organizations, as well as local Muslim community leaders and academics. And then also groups like the ACLU, and but also FBI and Homeland Security and the White House administration. And so what we were asked in that occasion is, they said, have you seen these recruitment efforts by ISIS, these videos that they're using to try and attract young people? And the room was a little bit silent, and I raised my hand. There was probably like 80 people in the room. This was still in Los Angeles before we went to the White House. And I said, I'm an imam. My name is Jihad. I don't Google search, ISIS recruitment videos. That's not what I do online. And they paused and they said, good idea. Let us show you some. And so they showed us a couple, and they tried, in this video, it was a very simple video. I remember one of them where they just showed some ISIS fighter going through kind of a makeshift hospital and visiting people who were wounded, et cetera. No words, a little bit of music in the background. And I was like, how is this a recruitment video? They said, well, what it's showing is that there's a sense of solidarity, and you can join something and be part of, and then what they do is they show this, anyone who expresses interest, they take them to the dark web, they recruit them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this is simply to say that groups like ISIS are not recruiting people based on theology. What they said is they're recruiting people based on people who have, let's say, they're at risk. They called it a cognitive opening. They have some kind of, maybe a dysfunctional family, maybe they face discrimination in their local communities, maybe they have a mental illness, something that gives them an opening. And then they have a grievance, whether they face economic disparity or racism, or they have some kind of animosity, or they object to U.S. foreign policy or drone strikes or U.S. military occupation in other places. And then, but here's the most important part, they actually then try and recruit people, giving young people a sense of purpose and belonging and excitement and adventure and all of that. So when I went to the White House, and there was a debate because Obama was not using this term, Islamic extremism, most of the intelligence community tends to be more conservative, and I asked them this question at every level. Should we use this term as Americans? Islamic extremism, Islamic violent extremism, radical Islamic terrorism. And to a person, they all said no, for that same reason that McMaster said, that it actually, they represent 0.0003% of the Muslim community, which is 1/4 of the world's population. Around, add up the 1.7, 1.8 billion Muslims around the world, it's almost 1/4 of the world's population. 0.0003% are supportive of extremist groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. That's such a small margin of the population that is, but the whole population is tainted by that. And when you do that, they said, it's actually detrimental to our national security interests because you're marginalizing young people who feel like they're, that they don't belong to this country, and then it makes them vulnerable to the recruitment efforts by groups like ISIS.
Amina, what's your take? So when you hear this kind of language, particularly this kind of language coming from what I'll call officialdom, what's your take? What do you make of it? What do you think we should make of it?
So I would say that Islamophobia and Islamic extremism or radical Islam or whatever you want to call it are kind of two sides of the same coin, and that what they're both doing that is wrong is, tar and feathering or creating broad sweeping judgments about a faith that is practiced by 1.8, 1.6, whatever you want to say, people in a way that would be similar to, looking at the KKK and assuming that that represents Christianity. So both are doing the same thing, and they both kind of feed off of each other, and the fears feed off of each other. And obviously, this was made much worse with 9/11, but our organization actually began back in 1993 when, if I'm sure most of you in the room, through much of my young school years, and certainly from World War II until that time, the boogeyman in the room was the Soviet Union. And the kind of tropes, the kind of frames that are common today about Muslims were common about the communists, the Russians. Remember the film, The Russians Are Coming? And it was actually in 1990, with the fall of the Soviet Union, thanks to the Afghani, and at that point we were calling them not jihadis, we called them mujahideen, which is how you actually say it in Arabic. And they proudly wore their Afghani outfits because we were funding them against the ungodly Soviets. And so enemies come and go, and we've seen many in the long history of our country, including here on the West Coast with the Chinese, with the Japanese, but even people who today are considered to be white, like the Irish, the Italians. I have a clipping of a contract that says if you are awarded this contract, you cannot hire Italians for labor. So the demonization of the group based on the actions of the few is nothing new. It is part of human nature, unfortunately, because we're all struggling to understand the world, but it is obviously harmful to the majority in a group that are being judged by the actions of a few.
But when we hear from or about ISIS, also called ISIL, also called Daesh, we are reminded that the name of the group is the Islamic State, and that the actions that they carry out are made in the name of Islam by men and women who purport to be Muslims who are adhering to their faith. What should we take from that? Because you've pushed back and said, not a fair, accurate, or helpful characterization, but there are others who say, well, wait a minute, it's the Islamic State, they say their actions are in the name of Islam, the people who are committing the actions call themselves Muslims. Why should people not make the connection that seems very obvious to some?
So again, to cite the example of the KKK, I mean, what was the symbol that represented them? It was a cross burning on people's lawn. But the same, and even if you go back to slavery, you had people arguing for slavery and against slavery, and they were both citing the Bible. You have the Lord's Army in Central Africa. You have Buddhist monks in Myanmar who are really fomenting this anti-Muslim hatred that has now resulted in about 500,000 people being made refugees in nearby Bangladesh. You've had the same thing in Bosnia, and I just read an article recently that the same thing might happen there. So unfortunately, we've had these episodes through history of religion being used by a minority of people to further their goals, which I think Jihad had been talking about earlier, were more, if you dig deeper, about power, about control, about resources, the kind of things that result in wars through history, unfortunately, whether in the name of religion or without. You know, in terms of ISIS, I kind of see them as the wayward grandchildren of Al-Qaeda, where even Al-Qaeda can look disapprovingly. And yet you read stories of people going to join ISIS with Islam for Dummies. Many of them used to frequent bars. Many of them, you know, didn't necessarily pray. Similar to the the hijackers, you read that they were in the bar the night before. So you see with a lot of these terrorist attacks, the people themselves are not necessarily strong adherents to Islam, but it's something else in the back of their mind, whether it's economics, whether it's, you know, a sense of not belonging, kind of like the reason that you see young people in Los Angeles joining gangs. You know, they have this need to belong somewhere. They have this desire for identity.
There is, of course, a distinction, which is that the Quran contains verses which critics will point to and say, this verse, this verse explicitly condones or even exhorts to violence.
So let me jump in on this one. Which verse did you have in mind?
Well,
Not to put you on the spot, but I did that on
No.
purpose only to say that there's a general vague reference to the Quran. And people will say oftentimes, oh, the Quran says to kill Jews and Christians. There is no verse in the Quran that says kill Jews and Christians. They'll take a portion of the verse that will scare the bejeebers out of you. Bejeebers is a technical term we use. And I'll quote it, and it'll scare you. And then I'll quote the rest of it, and it'll put it in context. There's a verse that says in the Quran in chapter 2, verse 192, that says, kill them where you find them.
that was the one I was going to mention.
Yes,
Jihad.
I knew that. And he was actually going to quote the Arabic as well. "Uqtuluhum haythu thaqiftumuhum," which is the Arabic, which is like, whoa, see, I knew it, right? But if you look at the verse, the before it, the one after it, it says, when as for those who do not allow you to practice your faith in freedom, and they expel you from your home, they kick you out of your homeland, then when you encounter them on the battlefield, fight them where you find them. But if your enemy is inclined towards peace, then you must make peace, because peace is preferred by God. And God does not like those who transgress.
And Jihad, forgive the interruption, but one of the points that has been made in each of the previous sessions is the diversity among the 1.7, 1.8 billion Muslims around the world. That's your interpretation of the verse. And what would I say to anyone afterwards who said, well, that's great, you had 2 moderate Muslims who were there tonight, but that's not really the exclusive interpretation or view of what the Quran exhorts?
So I actually didn't interpret it. I just quoted it. I didn't give an interpretation. I just read the full context, or the full verse before it and after it, or even not even the full. I quoted some portion of the verse before it and the rest of the actual verse. But in interpretation, I would say that historically, when all of this doctrine has been elucidated over the last 1,400 years through books of law, it goes even farther to contextualize or minimize warfare and violent context, where the rule is peace and the exception is war. And when like in the Catholic Church, they have something called the just war theory that does allow for warfare to take place at any time. And I'm not suggesting Islam is a pacifist religion, but what I am suggesting is that the Quran, all of the context of the Hadith, which is the teachings of Muhammad, and his biography and the early generations of Muslims indicate that there was a morality of war back at that time that was conducted by Muslims that does not exist in modern warfare, where you could not fight a non-combatant, a woman, an elderly person, a child. You couldn't damage the environment. There's prohibition in the books of law, all of them. All of the main orthodox and even non-orthodox traditions within Islam, all of this is elucidated that really limits when you can engage in military conflict. And the rule, like I said, is peace, and the exception is war. And when, as the Quran says, your enemy is inclined towards peace, you have to make peace. It's a commandment.
Amina?
Well, I want to add to that most of the victims of these terrorists are Muslims themselves. And so they could be blowing up their own mother for all they know when they go down and do their whatever it is. How do they possibly justify that? This is really at odds with the long history of Muslims, which, I mean, obviously they engaged in warfare, there were conquests, and that was basically how empires interacted with each other. But if you look geographically, if Muslims are commanded to kill all non-Muslims, how do you explain the fact that today 30% of Lebanese are Christian, that the holiest church in Christendom is actually, the keys to it are being held by two Muslim families because the Christian sects were fighting over it, and so they turned it over to the Muslims. One of them actually lives here in the Bay Area, Sayyid Nusayba. You go to India, where Muslims ruled for many centuries, and it's still a majority Hindu country. Not that Muslims, humans do horrible things, and I'm not saying that Muslims have not, but you can't prove geographically, historically, if you travel to the Muslim majority world, that it was the norm that Muslims killed all non-Muslims, or there's anything in the text that would make that the norm. This was the exception.
So let me just ask. Terrorism is usually, simply, technically defined as the use of violence to achieve political ends. Is terrorism, as you understand it, inherently inconsistent with Islam?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, jihad, the association of the word jihad with the word terrorism is actually totally incorrect.
Because?
The jihad actually means striving. It doesn't mean holy war, and it can be striving for any good cause, for justice. And actually, one of the verses in the Quran talks about if it were not that good people fought against the oppression of churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques, so it's not just religious freedom of Muslims, it's religious freedom for anybody, then people would be turned out of their home. So the verses in the Quran make it very clear that this is to defend the rights of people who are being oppressed, but these verses always end with, do not aggress yourself. And so terrorism in itself is aggression, because you are basically punishing innocent people for something they had absolutely nothing to do with, as well as going against the laws of warfare, which jihad mentioned, not killing women, not killing non-combatants. Basically, back in the day, wars were fought on the battlefield. They could lay siege to a town, but you didn't have the kind of capacity today to, press a button and bomb an entire population. So you could argue that terrorism is more an aberration and a response to modern warfare, where the inequality will lead people to do these horrible things.
I want to move on, Jihad, to the next question, which is, so we've talked about what the Islamic faith does or does not exhort its followers to do, does or does not prohibit them from doing. Certainly when Americans and American media talk about the tenets of the faith, there's a phrase that comes up a lot, which is Sharia law. And I know when I talk to American Muslims, at least, that's a term that is not favored among American Muslims, that they prefer just the use of the word Sharia. Could one or both of you tell our audience, what is Sharia, and why is the term Sharia law disfavored in your view, if it is?
Very good. Well, first, let me say I want to bring Amina along as my hype person whenever people ask me about jihad. She did a great job of explaining. It's just the striving to do the right thing. And the second thing I forgot to mention when I quoted the verse, which was, kill them where you find them. The enemies of Muhammad were not Christians nor Jews. They were his allies in Medina. The enemies were the pagan Arabs from his own tribe that expelled him and his followers from Mecca before peace was ultimately established towards the end of his life in the peninsula. So there are no verses in the Quran about targeting Muslims or Christians and Jews. And in fact, there's a verse in the Quran that says, Christians, Jews, whoever believes in God and does good will find their reward with their Lord. So salvation is attainable not just for Muslims. But as for the word Sharia, and it has a in there. I used to teach Arabic at UCLA, so you have to have that. There's letters that we have in Arabic you don't have. You're probably familiar with the kha, right? We have one of those, but we also have an Sharia. So Sharia just refers to the set of values or ethics that undergird our relationship not only to God, but to our fellow human being. And there's a similar tradition in the Jewish community, and it's known as halakha. How many of you are familiar with the word halakha? All right, they have a cha too. All right, so we're both Semitic. Arabic and Hebrew are both Semitic languages, so that's why we don't get along, because we're family. No, we get along. So halakha is just the Jewish law. It's the transactional, and in Los Angeles and many major cities here in the Bay Area, they have something called Beit Din, or Beit Din, which is kind of an arbitration court amongst Jews. Let's say if a woman wants to get divorced, the civil divorce doesn't count in terms of the religious. It's not recognized by the religious community as an actual divorce in the eyes of God, and so it's called a get. To get a Jewish divorce is called a get. So sometimes the women get civilly divorced, and their husbands never give them the religious divorce, and so to get a get, they have to go to a Beit Din, and they can then be considered divorced and then move on and get married to someone else. So there's a very similar tradition. In fact, Jewish law and Islamic law are identical in many regards. With regards to purity of food, they call it kosher. We call it halal. There's purity, not just in terms of how we handle the dead and how we wrap, and even the word coffin actually comes from the Arabic kafan, which is the wrapping. It doesn't refer to the box; it refers to the wrapping of the body, but it comes from the Arabic expression. So there's a lot of similarities in how we handle burial. Prayer ritual, all of that is under the rubric of this, what they would call halakha, what we would call Sharia.
And where does Sharia come from? So the source of that guidance is?
So Sharia is just a set of ethical values and principles and, laws, if you will, that are derived from the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad. And they tell us how to wash for prayer, when to pray, what food is permissible. Like Jews and Muslims, we don't eat pork, or at least we're not supposed to. Islam is halal dining is like kosher. The rules regarding halal is like the rules regarding kosher, except for it's kosher light. It's not as rigorous as in Jewish law, except that we can't drink alcohol, which is, I guess, the one thing that's more stringent in the Islamic tradition. But the reason why this is why we're talking about it is because some political thinkers, strategists, decided that they could scare a demographic to the polls to vote for, as a wedge issue, to vote for their party if they scare them into thinking that unless they go and vote and put in a constitutional amendment, let's say like in Oklahoma, what they did a number of years ago, you have to come to Oklahoma and vote during this midterm election to ban Sharia law from being implemented in our state, because Sharia law equals the stoning of women or the cutting off of hands. That's what they equated it with. And so people showed up. They were scared. We need to ban this. Oklahoma was not on the verge of passing a pro-Sharia law bill. It wasn't in the cards, but it's used as a scare tactic.
All right, so that being said, there are, and I may have lost count, but there were at least 9 or 10 states, if I remember correctly, that now have passed some kind of ban on Sharia law. Certainly many other states have raised the issue and tried. One of the rationales that is offered by proponents is that, in fact, Sharia does make its way into our court system, particularly with respect to, I'll call it family law matters, divorce, custody. What's your take on that, Amina, Jihad? I mean, this is, and we also have a card here. One of the questions on Sharia says, I presume that you are familiar with the problems which have occurred in Paris, France, with Muslim enclaves where only Sharia law is followed. French police do not go into these areas. How can we prevent that from happening here?
So let me answer the French part first, and then if you don't mind, Amina. So I actually traveled twice to France with Los Angeles City Councilman Tom LaBonge on a State Department visit, and we visited those areas that are referenced here. These ghettos, and I just came back last Friday I was in Sweden, in Malmö, which I used to pronounce it Malmö, but no, it's Malmö. It's the second largest city in Sweden, and I was keynote speaking at a conference on Muslim-Jewish relations because the claim was there that there are these enclaves and that there's all of this no-go zones and Sharia neighborhoods and all of that. And there's a lot of media hype there. There are no-go zones. The police go everywhere. We traveled and we moved in those circles and we went to some of the housing projects in France, in Paris, in Lyon, in Bordeaux. And we looked at the issue of integration of ethnic and religious minorities in France, best practices there, best practices in the US. We also hosted Alain Juppé, who was their prime minister at one point, here in the States. And there's a lot of hype and misinformation, fake news, et cetera, surrounding some of this. There are ghettos, but it's not that Sharia law is implemented there. French law is implemented there, and the challenge is that some of these minority communities, and we have them here in the United States, and some of the neighborhoods we have de facto segregation. Some parts of our large cities where there are...
Dearborn, Michigan is mentioned in 2 or 3 of the questions.
Well, but I'm referring to our minorities here being predominantly Black Muslim or Black Americans and some Hispanic Americans, where there are neighborhoods that are predominantly of those ethnicities, and the image in society is that they're crime-ridden, that they're gang-infested, that they're this and they're that, and the police can't go into those neighborhoods. There are some areas that are troubled, and they're troubled because of primarily economic issues, educational disparity, service disparity, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing exists in parts of Europe where the Muslim communities there are immigrants from majority Muslim countries. They're ghettoized. They experience a lack of education, a lack of economic opportunity and prosperity. Whereas Pew did a story about Muslims in America, or did a survey rather, that shows that Muslims in America are on average as educated and well-to-do as your average American. We're very well integrated here.
I want to stay with this issue of Sharia and the argument that it represents some kind of a threat that requires a response. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the areas that was specifically called out was the potential for, I'll call it the intrusion of Sharia in the American family law environment, specifically with reference to divorce or custody cases. I see you nodding in recognition. Can you tell us a little bit about what's that about in your understanding, and what's your take on whether this does or does not represent an infringement on American jurisprudence, for lack of a better way of putting it?
Well, first of all, a lot of the states that are adopting this anti-Sharia law, there's not a lot of Muslims there, which is kind of ironic. As it is, Muslims are like 1 to 2% of the population. Pew puts it about 3 to 4 million. Prior polls put it about 6 million. So why are they so concerned about this? Most people would say this is just a fear tactic. Secondly, I think it really begs confidence in our legal system, as if judges are suddenly going to be just hoodwinked because they're dealing with foreign law. I mean, they have to deal with foreign law all the time. We've become a global society where you have, corporations coming in with their different, ways of operating, and you can put tariffs and you can do all the sort of things we're seeing, the Trump administration doing now, but we still have to interact with people from different places who do things slightly differently. As Jihad talked about, the Orthodox Jews in New York have their own. Obviously, you look at Orthodox Jewish rituals, Islam looks like a piece of cake. I was at an event last week and they were just talking to me about kosher law. Sharia law is so much easier. Nobody's talking about how that is, somehow going to impact our court system. So I think it really begs confidence in our justice system and the ability of a judge to look at whether it's Islamic law, Jewish law, or just any foreign law, and see where it aligns with American laws and where it doesn't. They need to disallow it. And I looked at a few cases, and that's exactly what happens.
We keep the terms Sharia and Sharia law. What's the difference, and why is one favored and one disfavored?
I wouldn't say it's favored or disfavored. Sharia literally means path to water. The word for jurisprudence is fiqh, so there's a different term for the actual lawmaking. And it also gives the impression that there's one understanding of Sharia, when in reality, Islam went all the way, in the Far East to Indonesia, one of the largest Muslim populated country, to the far west, Morocco, etc. The way that Sharia was understood in these different places was quite diverse, and so it's not a monolithic understanding. There is this constant reformation of Sharia and the understanding of it depending on the time, the place, and there were traditionally 4 or 5 schools of thought. There were many others before that. The way they do things is slightly different. So you'll find some Muslims, when they pray, they'll put their hands like this. Others will put their hands like that. Both of them are considered to be Sharia. So the word law also gives it a more legalistic sense. As Jihad said, it's mainly concerned with my personal devotional practices, how I pray, how I fast, the 5 pillars. Very little of it is these other things. Certainly marriage and business law is a good part of it. The other place that it gets the bad name is also from about 5 punishments that are corporal, so capital punishment, stoning, etc., which is actually not in the Quran. And
It's in the Bible, by the way.
It's in the Bible, yeah.
It's not in the Quran.
Which is, the Bible is to Islam. I think you want to...
Oh, so yeah, Muslim. I was gonna give a confession though before saying that the Bible, Muslims look to the Bible as a divine revelation given to a prophetic figure that's recognized by Muslims, which is Moses, and then even Jesus, the Gospels, which when I was young I said the gossips of Jesus, but the Gospels of Jesus, are also Jesus is considered Christ in Islam. Born to the Virgin Mary, we kind of look to, not Muhammad is not Christ, but Jesus is. So we look to the previous traditions, and we see ourselves as part of an Abrahamic faith. So we look to those previous traditions as being divinely revealed, and the Quran, which came historically after both of them, even though Muhammad was also a descendant of Abraham through the older brother Ishmael, we hold generally the values of the other traditions, but the legal tradition we defer to the most recent version. We call it Scripture 3.0, with the Quran. And but I was going to say I have a confession to make. I actually, for many years, taught Sharia at a law school in Southern California, Southwestern School of Law. So watch out. No, I'm just kidding. And with regards to Sharia law versus Sharia, what we would say is that, when we were describing what it is that we're teaching, it was an elective at the law school, Southwestern School of Law. Do we call it an Islamic legal system, an Islamic legal code? And we actually said it's an Islamic, it's a religious legal tradition, is what we ended up going with. And so it is legal because it does have to do with governing how people interact, but it's more of a tradition than a code or a law. It's not, there's no legislation passed, it's not codified. They're principles. It's an ethical principle that is laid out in the Quran, and how that is interpreted depends on the time and place and the values of the community and culture in which those traditions are manifest. And so that's why I think Amina most beautifully put it, Islamic law manifests itself in Indonesia in a way that looks very Indonesian. And in Africa, and half of Africa is Muslim, by the way, looks very African. And here I'm heading up an Islamic graduate school where the values of Islam are manifesting itself in the way that we teach and how we approach religion in a way that looks very American. And as one Muslim spiritual leader, scholar, saint, if you will, Al-Ghazali, he put it, he said, Islam is like pure water, clear water that flows over various lands, allowing for the texture and the colors of that land over which it flows to shine through. And so Islam in America should look very American and should fit in with the pluralism that we all enjoy here as American citizens.
Well, let's go to a topic that's been in the news just lately, and that's what some people call the travel ban, other people call the Muslim ban. I'm guessing many in the room will recall that this is not our first experience. We're on, I believe, the 3rd executive order that is an effort by the administration to limit the travel, prohibit the travel of folks from certain countries. The Supreme Court recently heard arguments on the matter. I guess the the question I would ask you is, in your understanding, is the most recent proposed executive order, or the most recent executive order, in fact a Muslim ban? Some say that it is not, or should not be characterized that way, because it certainly includes nations which are non-Muslim majority, and it certainly excludes a great many majority Muslim nations. So therefore, the case is made, you can't really call it a Muslim ban. On the other hand, there are those who say, hey, there's no getting around the fact that the president called for a Muslim ban during his campaign, and that is ultimately the central thrust of the executive order. Your take on this issue, Amina?
I mean, it's hard to forget that Donald Trump said, Donald Trump is calling for a complete shutdown of Muslims coming to America, and that Islam hates us. Unfortunately, those words were pretty clear.
Islam likes me, though. I don't know.
Islam likes jihad. So you could call it the Muslim ban light. It's certainly an improvement on the first ban. I mean, I think each ban is getting closer to what could be considered constitutional, adding those two countries, although what I've read, it hasn't really made the same impact that it's had with these other countries.
Let me ask you two quick questions.
Yeah.
Do you call it the Muslim ban?
Muslims still generally do call it the Muslim ban. Yeah.
And do you think it's an effort by the administration to target Muslims?
I mean, that's what Donald Trump said in his campaign. And he tried the first time. It was knocked down the second time. So I think it's an effort to get it to stick and to be more constitutional. But I think the intent is still pretty clear. Now, he certainly has chosen countries that one could argue there is conflict there, but, allowing Syrian refugees in, and I think last year you said it was 10,000 refugees. This year there's been 8. There has been no linkage between refugees and acts of terror in this country, and so some of these certainly lead to a bias that can only be linked to their religion. He's also made statements about allowing minorities from some of those countries in, and so those would obviously be non-Muslims since these are majority Muslim countries.
Got it. Jihad, do you call it the Muslim ban?
Yes.
Do you think it targets Muslims purposefully?
Yes.
Okay. Let me share some data from a poll that just came out of Berkeley's Haas Institute, and I am almost sure the two of you have seen these numbers.
Must be a great poll coming out of Berkeley.
UC Berkeley, okay. Careful, remember your geography here, okay? So,
I'm used to hostile crowds.
there you go. According to a new poll from Berkeley's Haas Institute, 93% of Californians agree that respecting other people's cultural differences is important. Nonetheless, nearly half of Californians support the Muslim ban. In fact, 51% oppose banning people from majority Muslim countries from entering the United States, while 49% support the ban. Those were the numbers from the poll. Keep in mind that those are numbers about Californians. Keep in mind California is a place that voted very strongly against the current president. I guess my question is, what do you make of those numbers?
I blame it on Southern California.
It seems like this crowd wants to secede Northern California.
I would say that is pandering of the most adept sort, all right, just to be clear. All right, on a more serious note, though, Jad, seriously, do those numbers trouble you? This is California.
So listen, if I wasn't, like I said, I'm an American kid from Arizona. I just happen to have the name Jihad. But if my name wasn't Jihad and it was John, which sometimes I get called by mistake, I would probably be scared of Islam and Muslims too. Just from the atmosphere and from the ether. I mean, it's in the air. The way that the news covers religion. News doesn't cover religion well. I mean, if I just got my information from the news about religion, I would think that all Catholics support pedophilia and that all, it's really, really bad. News is not the place to get information about religion. And so, it's understandable that there is a fear of others, foreigners, there's a xenophobia oftentimes, depending on which news channel. I'm not going to mention any names, Fox. But depending on which news channel you watch, there's kind of an attitude or a posture towards certain ethnic groups, certain religious groups, et cetera, and fear-mongering that takes place there. And, one of my students, when I was teaching at UCLA as an adjunct many years ago, he was an NBC News producer here in the West Coast, and he had been around the time of the early days, back in the 60s, 70s, so he was a veteran in the field, and he says, news used to be a community service. He said we had Walter Cronkite who would come on 15 minutes in the evening, and it was a community service. It was something that was done to have the networks give something back. He said the nature of news has changed to what bleeds leads. There's a lot of sensationalism, fear-mongering, and really pandering to certain audiences in a way that's not of the best sort that Amina just did. But pandering to certain audiences and certain sentiments that is not helpful. And so we have to be, I would say, to be good citizens here in the United States, we have to be informed citizens, and we have to be active in acquiring our knowledge and not passive. And so you all coming out here tonight is a very big deal, and it's reaffirming to me in my American identity to have so many of you come out time and again. And the same thing last year when we did the similar series, the audience, we had to move it 3 or 4 different times because of how much interest there was. So I applaud your coming out, your interest in wanting to grow and learn directly from someone named Jihad and someone named Amina about what our faith means to us and how we navigate some of these tough questions.
Amina, let me let you get a word in edgewise here for a minute, because before the North-South divide gets
Even worse.
even greater. And again, I want to go to this. 49% of the Californians in what many people describe as a liberal state, a progressive state, said they supported the ban. What do you make of that?
So again, I agree with Jihad that it's fear. In terms of the media coverage, there's been reports that show that 60 to 80% of coverage of Muslims is in the context of violence, of terrorism. If you just think about the word terrorist, so when we began some 25 years ago doing this work, one of the first things we did was to meet with local media outlets in the San Francisco Bay Area, Islamic Networks Group, yeah, and their response is, wow, we've never met a Muslim before, where have you been? And we talked about the issue of, why is it that you talk about, and this was before 9/11, Islamic terrorism, Muslim radicals, but when you talk about other groups, you don't link it with their names. You don't call them Christian terrorists when you're talking about, the Serbs, or even with Timothy McVeigh, when they discovered it wasn't a Muslim or a Middle Easterner, they never talked about his religion. Today, you say terrorist, and people assume it's Muslim. In fact, whenever an act of violence takes place, like the one in Toronto recently, Muslims will literally listen and watch, and if they hear the word terrorist, they know that it's a Muslim behind it. If they don't hear the word, if it's lone wolf or mental health issue, they'll know it's not a Muslim. We all kind of sigh, heave a sigh of relief because we know that it's not a Muslim. So the term itself has become loaded. What is terrorism? So I actually heard a couple of programs about what are they called? The guy in Toronto, incel, it's this new term. These people are committing violence. They are very violent in some of their social media, and he committed this act of violence, and this wasn't the first time for this group, based on just their frustration that women don't like them. And what was interesting to me was that all the people that called in, this was on, I think it was on Forum, they're not even talking about the violence. They were talking about, these poor guys, and they were actually able to empathize with them in a way that you would never hear people calling in if it was a Muslim terrorist. And I noticed that also with the YouTube shooter. People were talking about YouTube policies and how this is so upsetting. Again, I'm honestly just empathizing with the perpetrator of the violence in a way that you will never see with Muslims. So there's this a kind of detachment of any other group from terrorism. What is terrorism? Is it only when a Muslim commits an act of violence? What about when a guy in Las Vegas sits on a rooftop and picks people off, and maybe we don't know why he did it, or someone who's sending bombs to African Americans or goes into an African American church? The exceptional violent status of Muslims is one that leads people to be afraid. and to be afraid of Islamic terrorism in a way that they are not when other acts of violence occur.
Well, we've talked about the Muslim ban, the travel ban. What about the notion of a Muslim registry, which came up early on, caused murmurs like that one, and certainly was, at least a year and a half ago, something that I heard a fair amount about from folks in the American Muslim community. What's the genesis of the concern?
Well, we wanted a registry, that way we can contact all of our people here in the U.S. No, actually, it was another, reaffirming moment as to, I think, the American spirit and the embracing of the diversity and the struggle for the soul of America. When I'm a religious leader and I get contacted by countless number of rabbi colleagues and Christian leaders, pastors, and fathers, etc., who said, if there is a Muslim registry, I'm going to be the first one to sign up and register myself as a Muslim. And it's, it's so moving. Our community that seems sometimes or feels sometimes vulnerable or at risk or timid, questioning, do we belong? Are we, what's our status here as Americans? And then we get that sort of embrace, that warm embrace from our fellow Americans. It's so reaffirming, reassuring, just meaningful to our community in ways that maybe not everyone understands. So yes, there is this rhetoric, threats of policies or laws, or whether it's a Muslim ban or the registry, or just labeling certain things as Islamo, fascist terrorism, etc. That leaves our communities, oftentimes, 2/3 of our community are immigrants. 1/3 are African American, by the way, and Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who's now on Dancing with the Stars. I can't wait. But the 2/3 that are immigrants are oftentimes feeling a little bit intrepid, and so to have that kind of response is reassuring. So yes, it's troubling, and then reassuring at the same time. It's kind of a little bit of both. It's a mixed bag.
Amina? Muslim registry?
Yeah, certainly at the time and place, people were worried. We joke about it. We say we hope that the camps, have a place for us to wash before the prayer, and we hope they have Wi-Fi, and it is a topic of
The
jokes.
Muslim concentration
The concentration
camp. That's what they're
That's
gonna put us
pretty
in, yeah.
dark humor.
I know. What are you going to do, right? And me and Jihad, when we were younger, we used to go to, he still goes, to a Muslim youth camp. So we try to think of it on that level. Japanese Americans have been one of the first to really come out and support American Muslims, because that's exactly what they see, as a possible threat. And so certainly in the event of a war, which we hope is not in the works, or God forbid a really serious attack, it certainly could be a possibility. I think the rhetoric, at least from the Trump administration, has kind of toned down. I know today he was asked to apologize about the Muslim ban, and he didn't, but even the fact that people are talking about that, I think realpolitik in some ways has kind of kicked in a little bit. Certainly very chummy with the Saudis. So I don't know if it's just rich Muslims that he likes. It's really
Business.
interesting. Yeah.
Let me go to another question. We got a number of these. Why are American Muslims not speaking out against radical and terrorist Muslims?
Because we support it. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, it's a funny question, because whenever I get asked that question, they said, it's assumed that we haven't spoken out. That's kind of embedded in the question. How come you have not spoken out? And the question I ask is, which Muslim leader or organization are you waiting to hear from? And then there's silence, because no one even knows. I say, okay, well, what's the largest organized group of Muslims on the planet? And you wouldn't know that either. There's a group of 50 million Muslims in an organization called NU, or Nahdatul Ulama, go with NU, in Indonesia. They wrote a book condemning Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They've given a fatwa. You think fatwa means it's a death threat or something like that, or a death order issuing someone, for someone to be killed. A fatwa is just a legal opinion. So every major Islamic scholar on the planet has issued a fatwa condemning ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Every major leader, or every leader of a Muslim majority country has condemned ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Every Muslim organization in the West and in Europe issued a fatwa condemning ISIS and Al-Qaeda. When I first became the imam, or the religious director at the Islamic Center, it was in June of 2005. And the first week, we, on Friday, we announced to the press, we are going to issue a fatwa. And man, our mosque, which usually is pretty packed anyway, but now was packed not just with people coming to pray, but with wall-to-wall cameras, print news, everyone was there, radio. And we issued a fatwa, and we did it in conjunction with 20 major national organizations in the United States and Western Europe. And we all issued a fatwa condemning Al-Qaeda. ISIS didn't exist back then, but condemning Al-Qaeda and making it a religious obligation to cooperate with law enforcement to protect our country from any prospective danger or attack from someone within the Muslim community that we might come to know about, and all the sleeper cells that are going on now. But to work with law enforcement to protect our country, because we're, as Amina said, we're the biggest victims numerically of terrorism around the world. And when it happens in the United States and is perpetrated by someone who's claiming to do it in the name of religion, not only are we victims because they're attacking our country as Americans, but also we feel victimized because some of the response to that is an otherizing of our community.
But again, the question is about why don't we hear, quote, moderate Muslims
because,
speak out more?
Because the news is not interested in covering all of that. So it's already there, and you're assuming that Muslims are not. And there was a college student in Colorado who published a list of all the condemnations, everyone who's issued a condemnation on every occasion in which there's been a cause for it, because she was, that was the number one question that Muslims are asked whenever we speak publicly. And so she's just like, let me just make a list. And she published a list. You can Google it. But my point is, it's there. You're assuming that it's not there just because it didn't come to you because you're passively waiting for the news to share that bit of information with you. I have news for you. The news is not going to share that information with you because it's not newsworthy in their estimation. Like I said, what bleeds leads, the way that they cover religion. We did a peace event at the Islamic Center. It was a commemoration of 9/11, interfaith event. We had the civic society represented, and the news showed up, and they said, and this was again 2006, I think. The news showed up, and they said, "So, what are you guys doing here?" And I explained, we are all coming together, and we have a peace awards, and we're commemorating the victims of 9/11, and we're trying to bridge. They said, yeah, that's great. Do you know that later on there's going to be the Minutemen marching and they're going to burn an effigy of Osama bin Laden and this and that? I said, yeah, I'm aware of that. It's going to take place at a mosque across town. What do you think? I said, well, our approach is different. We try to come together and listen and be civic, and civil in how we interact with one another. And the media, the interviewer from Channel 9, she pulled me aside. She said, oh, come on, you could say something more sexy than that. Literally, she told me that, and she wanted me to be angry, and she had a framing in her mind of how she wanted to air it. And news just is not interested, and they wouldn't have come had there not been a protest scheduled later on that day to cover our peaceful event. News does not cover what's really going on. They cover points of interest that will, attract viewers. And so it's not going to come to you. You have to go and look for it. But I assure you, Muslims are condemning it. You just haven't done the hard work of going out. Although you've done the hard work of coming here tonight, but you haven't done the hard work of actually looking at what Muslim leaders have said historically and
there is a
universally.
website called The American Muslim. Sheila Musaji actually has been collecting condemnations of terrorism for a long time, since 9/11, I believe. I was actually part of a group that put out a fatwa in 2005 against terrorism generally. And then specifically about ISIS, there was a letter to the so-called Caliph Baghdadi that was signed by 100 clerics and clergy, and it went through all of the ways that their actions go against Islamic teachings. There's been also a book or books written about it. I have one by a Syrian cleric named Sheikh Yaqubi. So it's out there, and I urge people to go look at it. It's called tam.org, The American Muslim.
Okay. I'm going to...
We've answered all your questions, it seems. No?
Well, you certainly haven't answered all the audience questions, and I'm going to ask a question that's a little different. I'm going to ask Amina to answer first, and then I'm going to go to you, Jihad, because I'm going to call you out specifically in the question, and I want to give you a minute to think about it. So At my invitation, you've agreed to be here for this third and final program in the series. We walked on stage, we sat down, and I immediately started to ask you about terrorism, the threat or perceived threat of Sharia. Shared with you the fact that 49% of the state supports a Muslim ban. Asked you why, on behalf of the audience at least, why more moderate Muslims did not speak up and protest. Most of us in the room, myself included, don't get asked these questions and don't have to justify our point of view, our position, our faith. The question I want to ask you, and I'm going to go to Amina first, as I said, the question I want to ask you is, how does that make you feel? But Amina, before you ask, Jihad, you and I did not know each other before you participated in the program last year. We have not been in touch except to have you come back again this year. I can't help but noticing, and I think this would be hard not to notice,
That I've lost more hair between now and then?
well, I never noticed such things, Jihad. But what I was going to say, and you gave me the perfect opportunity, is you deflect a lot through humor. It is, in my observation, the way you respond to a lot of these difficult questions. If I were into pop psychology, and I'm not, I might even say it strikes me as a defense mechanism. So I'm going to let you think about that a little bit. But Amina, I'm going to go to you first, and I'm going to say, what does it feel like? Because this is what you do with your life. It is your calling, as I understand it. And, how does it feel to have people say, please justify your faith. Please assure us that your faith doesn't mean this, this, or this. Oh, and by the way, half the people in the state you've chosen to live in would support something called a Muslim ban. What does that feel like? How does that affect the way you go through your daily routine, if I may ask?
It's tiring. It can be tiring. I mean, the thought crossed my mind today, why didn't I study biology or mathematics? I wouldn't have to be doing this all day long. Although in the morning I had a presentation about the Virgin Mary, and that was really lovely to show the commonalities. Most people, as Jihad said, don't know how much the Quran respects and reveres the Virgin Mary. So sometimes we get to talk about like normal things. It's mainly when I'm on an interfaith panel. ING also does interfaith panels.
Just when we're interviewed by Joe. That's the only time that we get the tough questions.
What is it?
I said only when we're interviewed by Joe do we get the tough questions.
No, that's not true. But and I teach a class on Islam, so it's not all the time. And what I admire most is when I'm on an interfaith panel and other panelists are kind of put in the hot seat a little bit. So I was on a panel last week, and the Hindu representative was asked about the caste system. I've had Catholics asked about pedophilia. So yeah, it's great when there's equal opportunity and all religions have their good points and their bad points. But yeah, the ability to just be who you are without always being on the defensive, it's a pipe dream at this point, but I'm hoping maybe in 20 years it'll be a reality for American Muslims. And I think it's, young Muslim kids growing up surrounded by people from different backgrounds and just that familiarity that entails not being afraid of the other that may practice slightly different than you.
Jihad, and I'm going to preface my repeat of the question with I'm looking for a serious answer. How does that make you feel?
I'm not going to start with a joke. All right. You laughed anyway. I appreciate you giving me a minute to think about it because I took that time. For me, the religion, having a Christian mom and a Muslim father and growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, it gave me a license to look to religion, to both religions, and to begin a spiritual journey as a young teenager. And I could have gone in many different directions. In high school, I was good in sports, I was good in academics, I was popular, I was homecoming king of my high school senior year, yes. Amina, you didn't know that about me. We go way back. some things she doesn't know.
We've
Very
moved,
different than
we've
my high
moved from
school.
humor to bragging, Jihad. I just want to point that out.
Well,
Only a
Well,
man, right?
my best quality.
Oh.
My best quality is.
Oh,
My best quality is that I'm humble. But seriously, I mention that only to say that in the one hand, I was achieving the benchmarks of what would bring you happiness, but at the same time, my sister had a serious illness. My parents, that led to ultimately to my parents divorcing, and so at the age of 16, 17, I began a spiritual journey. In response to that, instead of turning to drugs, alcohol, whatever, I had encountered some people who took religion seriously, who also became mentors and who cared for my soul. And, I started to ask the big questions in life. And to me, that journey ended up taking me around the world, and I got to understand myself and the diversity and the complexity and the beauty of humanity all around the world. I studied in seminary in the deserts of Saudi Arabia at a time in which my cousin was there participating in the U.S. military armed forces during Gulf War I. And I was, bombs were falling and warfare was taking place, but I was finding inner peace in the seminary, which wasn't part of the conflict. It was nearby but not affected. And I said, okay, well, what do I want to do with my life? Now that I've found this inner peace and beauty and warfare is happening, I said, let me come back to the States and switch from, I had taken off after my freshman year of college to go and study in seminary. And so I said, let me come back and finish my undergraduate career and pursue Islamic studies and go into academia so that I could teach about religion and civilization and history and theology and religion in a way that brings people together and doesn't divide people and lead inevitably to conflict and warfare and violence. And let me do this as a way, because I'm a bridge in many ways with not just my ethnic background. My dad's Palestinian, my mom's American, or my dad's Arab, my mom's American, but the religious differences that I had growing up. And to me, I saw religion as a pathway, not the only pathway, but a pathway by which we can be called to our higher self and achieve ultimate inner peace. And so the tough conversations about what is Islam and how does it fit into the conflicts and, all of the interest that people have and the fear that people have, to me, I'm not tired by it, and I don't blame you for being tired by forcing it. I'm not tired by it at all, because it's a core part of who I am, my faith. Not that I'm the best believer in the world, but I find beauty and strength in my faith, and for me to have the opportunity to share with people. Humor is a way to connect. It's not a defense mechanism. I say defensively. But it's a way to connect, to break the tension that exists in the room in order for the important conversation to be had. And we can get to this kernel like we're doing now. So it's helpful, even in the way you structured the series, to start with what is Islam, women in Islam, and then the tough issues. I appreciated that trajectory because when you start out at what does your faith mean to you and how is it that you practice it, and then the tough questions, which are part of the conversation, but that's not how you're framing it at the beginning. It really does, hopefully, if people watch all three series or all of you who attended all three, hopefully you get a sense of what is the core and then hear what's on the periphery of the faith. And so I don't know if that answered your question, but for me, I kept saying I'm reaffirmed in my faith in America, my faith in my fellow human being, etc. I really do believe that people in general are good and that there are always bad actors in our community, and I think there are a couple bad actors in everyone else's communities, I've been told. But ultimately, most people are good, and if you get the opportunity to see the beauty and the divine spirit that's been blown into each one of our souls by God Almighty, and relate to people at that level, then usually that's reflected back in the way people treat you. And so I appreciate the opportunity to come and have this conversation with you each year. And that means I'm looking forward to next year as well. No.
Thank you. Thank you both for letting me probe a little bit more personally in that way. Another issue that I have to believe affects the way the American Muslim community feels about its identity here in the United States is the issue of surveillance. I think it was about a year ago, actually, when we did this series for the first time, that the New York City Police Department had just agreed to a revised settlement after years of profiling and surveilling Muslim members of the community. Are members of the local Muslim communities in the place you do your work concerned about similar behaviors by law enforcement? What have you seen in the communities where you live and work?
Well, I was reading about Boston where there was surveillance of social media, and I think with the whole Facebook fiasco, everyone's very aware of that now. I've had a few Facebook friends say they're going to get off Facebook, but nobody gets off Facebook. So, this is the world we live in. Muslims will often joke when they're talking to each other on the telephone that there's a third party listening in. It's, we're just joking. We're careful not to use certain words. I'm not going to say it in front of the camera right now.
Like jihad?
Well, not even jihad. It's like, that was a bomb, and being at the airport, obviously, there's certain words you're not going to say. So it's an issue. It's not at the forefront of people's minds. It may, like in some communities, also under surveillance for different reasons, prevent people from calling law enforcement or make them very anxious if they are stopped by law enforcement. And certainly areas like the Detroit area, we hear of similar kind of surveillance that's going on. I haven't heard specifically in Northern California. I know that you've had issues in Southern California of
I have a story.
plants in your mosques.
I have a story I'll tell later.
All right, go ahead.
Go ahead and finish.
No, that's good.
Later has arrived.
Later has arrived, all right. So I was the imam at the Islamic Center of Southern California.
And briefly, tell everybody what an imam is again.
It's the best thing in the world. No, I'm just kidding. An imam is like the father, the priest, the rabbi, but for the Muslim community. Although we have no ordination, and we're the most disorganized, organized religion on the planet, I think I mentioned last time. So we don't really quite have a process by which you become an imam. So I had studied in seminary, but I also studied Islam here, and so the community said, we want you to be our religious leader. So they hired me at that time, 2005, at the Islamic Center. So I was there as the imam, and I got a phone call from the Associated Press saying, are you the Islamic Center that the guy is referencing in court? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. They said the guy in open court just mentioned that he was at the Islamic Center and this and that, and they started telling a story. So it was featured on This American Life. Anyone ever listen to This American Life? Find it. It's a great episode. I'm going to, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it now. So back in the day there was COINTELPRO, which was FBI sort of infiltrating black civil rights groups or black power movements here in the Bay Area, of course, the Black Panthers and other parts of the country. And then they would oftentimes have agent provocateurs go in and try and take the movement and make it illegal, do something illegal, and they would come in and arrest people, et cetera. So this was part of an FBI. It's all been, there's been a lot of books written about it, et cetera. So what happened was in this case, and it came out in trial, that the FBI had hired an agent provocateur to go into the Islamic Center, not where I was working, but in Irvine, and he would go and he would have a recorder on him and he would go and talk to people about jihad and terrorism and things like that and try and get someone to say something that's incriminating. And this one member of the community was alarmed by this guy going around and having this really inappropriate conversations with people, so he called the FBI on him. And he's like, yeah, there's this guy, and he's talking about, I'm just doing my civic duty. And he's like, oh, great, thank you for telling us about it. We want to recruit you to work for the FBI. And he's like, no, I'm not interested in that, but I'm just doing my civic duty because there's this guy, and they're like, yeah, thank you, we know about that. So we want you to work for it. He's like, no, I'm not interested. They said, you don't understand. We want you we want you to work for us. He says, well, I'm not going to. And he says, well, and this was over a series of phone calls. They said, well, if you don't work for us as an agent or an undercover person, recording conversations and whatnot, then we'll revoke your U.S. citizen. He was a nationalized U.S. citizen from Afghanistan. They said, we're going to revoke your U.S. citizenship. He goes, do it. He said, do what you need to do. I'm not going to work as a spy for the FBI and try and incriminate people. I'll do my civic duty if I see someone who's doing something illegal or who's, has a violent rhetoric. I will report on that person, but I'm not going to work for the FBI. So they took him to court to get his citizenship revoked. Who did he call as a witness? The agent provocateur that worked for the FBI. So in open court, he was an ex-con that they hired to work as this, confidential informant or whatever. He's like, yeah, I was hired and was given a couple $100,000 by the FBI to go and record and this and it came out in open court. And so, boom, that hit the news. And you may not have heard about it, but This American Life did, and they did an episode on it. So listen to the episode. It's fantastic. My point is, I met the agent who was responsible for that, for running that program in the work that we did in the run-up to that summit on countering violent extremism. And I told him, I said, what was your thinking? Like, why were you doing that? And he says, well, we just don't have the resources, so, this is just more cost-effective. I said, it's not cost-effective. You're alienating or you're breaking the bond of trust with this large demographic of people who are your best allies in identifying when someone is bringing threatening rhetoric to the community. It's counterproductive. And he's just like, yeah, well. And basically what I gleaned from that and a number of other cases, and there have been, a dozen or more cases around the country of similar agent provocateurs that have been exposed in a similar fashion. What came to light is that oftentimes these agents are trying to get a feather in their cap to have something on the books like, oh, we caught one, and see, look, and then they get promotions, et cetera. So it's really short-sighted strategy. And when I was at the White House, I happened to meet his boss's boss's boss, and we were there and we were talking, and I asked him about it at the White House. And we were just in the hallway and we were chatting, and he was like, what? I didn't hear about this. And then the guy walks by. And he's like, Chris, come over here. Tell me about this case. And the guy melted to a puddle. And he just was like, I can't really talk about it. It's still ongoing. And, he didn't have an answer. But it was so...
Jihad, that means you're an informer.
More like a tattletale.
Okay, tattletale. There you go.
But it was surreal to be in that particular context. But so to answer your question, the way that surveillance is oftentimes conducted by certain agencies is counterproductive, and that there are better ways to protect our country than to cast the net of suspicion over the 3 million American Muslims that live here. It's un-American to do so, and also not good practices.
All right, let me ask a couple of quick questions because we have a little less than 10 minutes left, and I want to try and squeeze in as many questions as I can. So I'll try and make the questions short, and if we could do the same with the answers.
We can't do short answers.
Well, let's try. Amin, if I heard you correctly, you indicated that the surveillance culture, I'll call it that, has affected the way people in the American Muslim community use social media and think about their presence in the digital world. Jihad, do you have the same experience? Is that your observation as well?
I was expecting the question to go to Amina, so I didn't hear the question.
The question.
I was talking so much, I was like, it's her turn. I'm going to give this one.
So do folks in the American Muslim community, mindful of the potential for surveillance, self-censor, use social media differently than the members of this audience and or their sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters might?
Oftentimes, yes, there's self-censorship.
All right. Question is, what do you think of the Patriot Act? Any concerns?
I think like surveillance, anytime you have a government policy that is focused on one particular group of people, that casts this shadow of suspicion over them, and it doesn't necessarily bring results. And there's this sense of urgency that Jihad kind of talked about, where we got to show results. We're spending all this money, we have all these laws, we got to find something, and then people end up with bad decision making. So does it make for, actual more security in this country? I would say probably not, and it does alienate the American Muslim community, which is our best ally. I mean, so many of the terror plots were alerted, the authorities were alerted because American Muslims felt it was their duty. Because again, as Jihad said, we pay the price doubly. As Americans and then as Muslims, we get the backlash. And so working with American Muslim communities for the security of all communities, I think is the better track to take, and when people feel like they are under this cloud of suspicion, that's not necessarily what they're going to do.
Jihad, the Patriot Act?
What she said.
Okay. Here's a question. Why is Islam politicized when Christianity and Judaism is not in this country? A moment, please. I'm just reading the question, everybody.
I mean, we're at war with a couple of Muslim majority countries, Iraq and Afghanistan. We're not at this point at war with a country that represents another religion. I mean,
You just said at this point, didn't you?
yeah, I mean, so Vietnam, I wouldn't call that a religious war, but certainly, if during the Vietnam War era, someone would have predicted that the next wars are going to be with this religion of Islam, people would have not believed you probably, because again, at that time, our enemy was the Soviet Union. Vietnam was kind of the rallying cry for that. And so we have a very short memory. We forget history. I mean, the biggest war in the 20th century and probably in the entirety of history was World War II, which was fought between European, Western Christians among themselves. Muslims, if anything, were kind of victims. They were brought in, and much of their lands, were then cut up and divided along colonial lines. But, wars have been fought for so many reasons. Foreign policy is not and has not always been about religion or about Islam. It's just been in the last, I'd say, 20 years, and certainly since 9/11.
All right. I have a question. What was the poll number of people who conducted it that said 49% of Californians want or support a Muslim ban? Seems high to me. And what I would say to the questioner in the audience is, I can't remember the sample size. I remember when I saw it that it was a healthy sample size for.
It was done by Berkeley, so it must be correct.
And that's what I was going to say is, if you want to go online and Google it up, all of this was in the news within just the past 10 days, if I recall correctly, and the poll should be readily available online. But it was a healthy sample size, I remember, because I had the same question when I read the reports in the press. I want to get to what I'm going to have to say is the last question, and I think it's a nice way to end the third program in our series this year. It says, thank you for your positive and light way. Thank you for the positive and light way you encounter the constant media assault on a belief, parentheses, religion, called Islam. How do you teach children to respond when children do not have the sophistication to respond as an adult would? Yet, children are confronted at schools by adults like teachers and administration who may not understand.
So children, I would say, are more free of stereotypes than adults because they haven't been exposed to the same news sources, to the same movies. We haven't even talked about Hollywood, and if you're interested in how Hollywood has portrayed Islam and Muslims, there's a book called Real Bad Arabs. You can also watch the documentary, and the author, Dr. Jack Shaheen, a Christian Arab professor, goes through hundreds and thousands, well, hundreds, let's say, I'm not sure if it goes to the thousands, but TV shows and movies that portray Muslims and Arabs in a negative light. And so children may be more familiar with Aladdin or more familiar with a video game that casts Muslims or Arabs in that negative light than, a Fox News or some of the issues that the adults might be talking about, although they may be at the kitchen table and hear their parents talk about things. And we've heard, obviously with all of the anti-Muslim sentiment, bullying. There's a CARE report they do every year on bullying in California. This year, I think it's like 53% of Muslim students have been bullied.
Excuse me, Amina, when you said a CARE report, you meant
CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations. Yeah, they've been doing
Thank
the
you.
report now for about 3 or 4 years, so we've
So
seen some
half
of the
of all
spike.
Muslims have been bullied?
Muslim students, yeah. And it's mainly verbal bullying, but also girls who wear the headscarf. I think it's like 39% who wear the headscarf have had their headscarf touched offensively or pulled, and this often spikes when there is either a campaign
So
or
what do
some
you
kind of
say
an
to
event.
those kids? How do you help guide them through the challenging times in which we live?
it's difficult because they look to the adults for how to behave. I mean, a lot of the Muslim kids are scared. We heard during the Trump campaign that, 7-year-olds were scared that they're going to be deported. They were packing their suitcases, and when asked why they're doing it, it's like, we're going to have to leave. And then, of course, when children see adults behaving in a manner that is, abusive or with bias, they often mimic it. And we hear stories of teachers, for instance, having conversations during current events where they're calling out Muslim students, saying things
I have
that
a
are...
story maybe that could answer the question.
Yeah.
No, because that's an important question, and so I actually have an anecdote,
go
a
for it.
story, a moment that I experienced, because as the imam, I also, part of my job description was to lead the youth group at the Islamic Center, and it was a very large, dynamic, diverse group of young people, middle school, high school age. And one year, at the beginning of the school year, a freshman walks into my office before the youth group meeting started. And he was Indian or Pakistani, tall for his age, taller than me even, and was a bit of a teddy bear of a guy, a little bit plump, and he walked up to me, and he kind of was slouching in his posture and intrepid, and he came to me, or fearful, I should say, came to me in my office, and he said, I just started at a new school, and everyone's picking on me, the students, even the teachers. I don't feel safe, I'm miserable, I can't go to school. He was on the verge of tears. And he's like, what do? I don't know what to do. And I said, okay, I'll tell you what. Just give us the word. We will bring all of the resources of the community. We'll go and we'll set up a community meeting with your principal, with the teachers. We'll do an assembly for the whole school. We have your back. Just give us the word. We'll come. Guns blazing. No, not guns blazing. We'll come in force. I said, that's one option. I said, or you can try and understand what's going on, the psychology of what's going on. Because kids in high school can be mean. And really what's going on is the kid who's saying something mean, or maybe not the teacher, but the kid who's saying something inappropriate or mean, who's bullying, they're trying to position themselves in the social order by intimidating someone who they feel is defenseless, who can't defend themselves, and then they're trying to get the other people to have a little bit Machiavellian, right? To kind of fear but then respect them as well. And so that will raise them in their social standing. So they'll pick on you because you're Muslim. They'll call you terrorist. They'll call you this and that, ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever. But they're also going to pick on the person who maybe has pimples, or is short, or is too tall, or is too heavy, or is too thin, or whatever the issue is that makes them different. They'll pick on anyone who looks different or they feel that they can intimidate. I said, understanding that psychology, you can respond to it in a kind of a psychological judo move. And number one, even if it does hurt your heart, don't let that person have that power, or let them see that they have that power over your emotions. And in fact, you can use humor as a defense mechanism, although I didn't have to. Remember, I was homecoming king. But although you can use that, you can use self-deprecating humor. You can just show that it not only doesn't hurt, you have a sense of humor and it doesn't bother you. And then if the person persists, I guarantee you, even though you probably know nothing about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, even Islam, or the international politics or warfare or anything, I bet you know 1,000 times more than that person does. So if they say, oh, you're ISIS, all you have to do is say, oh yeah, what do you think? Should we support the Kurds in their, in their efforts, or should we support the Shiite majority democratically elected government? The person's going to look like a deer in the headlights and is going to seem like they're completely ignorant, and they're going to be intimidated, and they're never going to ask you or pick on you again. So a few weeks later, he comes back into my office, and this time he's not slouched over. He's standing tall. He has a big smile on his face. He says, he told me in that first meeting, I'm going to go with option 2 first. If I need to, we'll call you in. So anyway, he comes back a couple weeks later, smiling, standing tall, and he goes, I tried what you suggested, and it worked. And I don't have any problems anymore. No one bothers me. So every case is different, and sometimes we do have to go in and have an assembly and escalate it, if you will. But sometimes just empowering young people on how to deal with bullying. You know, they could be bullied because, you know, maybe they're a member of the LGBTQ community or whatever the issue is. Helping young people deal with the psychology of bullies and responding not in a way that is negative, but to, you know, to use that kind of psychological judo to diffuse the situation can sometimes be the more effective approach and can help that person in general navigate the difficult teenage years in general.
Jihad Turk, Amina Jandali, thank you both very much for being here tonight. And let me say thank you once again to all of you for being part of this series once, twice, or thrice. I hope you leave feeling that it was both edifying as well as enjoyable. Have a good evening, and thank you so much for being part of these community conversations over the past 2 weeks. Thank you.